All right, so we're picking up here with this example of the African American jury panels. Now, remember that we assume the null hypothesis to be true, i.e. the proportion was 50%, which is the jury was fair and representative, right? Unless we can prove it otherwise. Unless we can prove the jury was rigged. Now I'm writing it out in words, but what matters to us in this particular example will end up being the symbols, because the proportion of people in the county that were African American was 50%. So therefore the proportion in the jury panel should be 50%. If it was like 35% for the county, then you'd expect about 35%. And you'd assume that to be true unless you can prove it otherwise. So then what's going to happen is you'll get some data and you'll make a decision. And then you have to decide what you're going to do. So we're never going to accept anything. Hear that? You never accept the hypotheses without having access to the entire population. You don't know for sure what happened. You're only going to be able to make two possible decisions. You will either reject the null hypothesis or you will not reject the null hypothesis. That is it. So if we think back to our first example, if you reject H naught, this would be for the dice. Hold on. I got to get this fixed here. Okay. So if we think back to the dice, you either reject that the dice were fair, right? You assume they were fair, or the dice roller, depending if you rolled actual dice or used in a computer to do it, or you do not reject that the dice were fair, right? You're not accepting that the dice are fair. You're basically saying, I'm not sure the dice are fair. I just didn't have enough evidence to prove that they weren't. Or I assume the dice are fair because I didn't get enough evidence to prove otherwise. It's a lot like the board game Clue, which was one of my favorite games as a kid. You know, you'd say, I think Colonel Mustard did it within the dining room with a candlestick. And people say, I don't have enough evidence to prove you wrong. That's what they let you know, right? So that's sort of what you're doing here. Now, if we think about this jury example, what would happen if we reject the null hypothesis? If you reject the null hypothesis, you're rejecting that the proportion was 50, right? So that would mean, let's put it this way, you're rejecting that the jury was fair. You don't know that it wasn't fair. You're just rejecting it, right? You're saying, okay, I got enough evidence. I don't think it was fair, right? If you don't reject the null hypothesis, it means you do not reject that the jury was fair. Now notice you're not accepting anything. It's not saying like, oh, I'm 100% sure this jury was fair, or I'm 100% sure this jury was not fair. It's not quite like that. It's more like, I have evidence to support that it wasn't fair, or I have evidence to support that it was. Okay? But you're never going to be like, oh yeah, I'm 100% sure, right? Speaking of which, if you're never 100% sure, that means that you can create errors, right? So let's think about the null and alternatives here. So you can do things that are correct. You can have errors that show up. And I think this table up here will become more obvious to you when I go over it down here. So let's think about the legal system in America, shall we? I know it's not one of your favorite topics probably, but you know, as your criminal justice major. All right, so what is assumed to be true of defendants unless we can prove it otherwise? That's your first thing. So the null hypothesis in the American judicial system is that you are innocent. Oops, innocent. At least that's what they claim. And then the alternative to that is that you're guilty, right? Okay. So, you know, it's one of the constitutional rights that you are innocent until proven guilty. Which is not, by the way, the same as it is in Britain. Okay, so I'm going to start this table. I won't have time to finish it. So let's suppose H naught is actually true. So you did not commit the crime. Right? That's what's right here. Or H1 is true. You actually did commit the crime. I knew I wouldn't have time to finish this. I'll finish this in the next one.